experiencing in terms of the housing market and foreclosure are rippling around the globe. We hear all kinds of concerns being raised, and some people say we're moving into a recession. And on a late night talk show, I got a definition of recession, which I will share with you. I believe it's Jay Leno. A recession is when you can't afford the gas to drive to a job you're about to lose, to pay for a house you can't afford. And this is a not so funny situation in our country right now, and one in which there are many, many casualties. And the casualties are people who are losing their homes, and the casualties are also banks, believe it or not. So today, what we want to do is see if in this issue, which has so many ripples and has so many effects, if we can focus our attention and bear in and look at the situation of what's happening here in the state of Massachusetts. What's foreclosure? What's a mortgage? How did we get into this deep, deep hole? And how do we get out? So we've assembled a wonderful array of panelists who have been working very hard on this issue. And I will say that when I called the Mass Housing Partnership and spoke with Susan Conley about putting this panel together, she said, you know, Maureen, I have to tell you that Worcester is doing an enormous amount. And the problems are big, but the number of arms with sleeves rolled up and the energy that the city is now putting into doing something about this issue is something that we can take assurance in. So what I would like to do is to introduce all our panelists and then allow them to share with you from their various vantage points how they see the situation. Following all of the presentations, we are opening this up for questions. I want to alert you to the fact that because of the way class times work, we have classes who have come and will go. We have another class which will come at 3. And we have our South High students from the Youth Policy Council who are coming on bus as we speak, and they will arrive whenever they arrive. So you folks have to go with the flow, and this will be a flow here this afternoon. But we want you to know that we're glad that you could come and that we're all very interested in this topic. We're going to start off with Josh Lappen, who is with the Mass Housing Partnership. And Josh is an assistant loan officer there. He has experience in banking from being at Middlesex Savings Bank to being a lending assistant to now being an assistant loan officer. And he's been in Worcester a while because he's a graduate of Clark. And it's good to have you from that other school. We have good relationships with Clark. There's no rivalry. So we're really happy that you could come and be with us. And we are aware that you've also been an Urban Development and Social Change Research Fellow as well. So Josh brings a lot to the table. Next up is our own Scott Hayman, who is the director. Are you going to be next or Amanda?
I think I am.
Or Amanda's next. All right. Ladies first. Amanda Wilson is the Director of Housing Enforcement for the City of Worcester, the Department of Inspectional Services. And she has been working with the city for the past 8 years. She has a very, very big job on her hands, and she does it quite well. She has a BA from the University of Massachusetts, and she has a master's from Clark, once again, our sister university. She doesn't know this, but your real claim to fame on this campus is that you're Nancy Moses' boss. Oh. And Nancy is a senior urban studies major who's leading all other students in her grade point average and does a lot to raise the level here. And she's always telling the students, you ought to go work for the city and let me make a call for you here. So she does many, many referrals. Scott is the Director of Housing of the City of Worcester, and he was formerly the Director of Central Mass Housing Alliance, and he also then worked for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I think of Scott as our housing warrior. He has been in this battle for a very long time. He's also an incredible resource for us. Last year when we did a series with the Youth Policy Council, Scott agreed to take us on a tour of all of the developments here in Worcester, and we had quite a time. We are also happy to have with us Fran Paquette, who is the director of NeighborWorks, Home Ownership Center of Worcester. That's where so much of this foreclosure prevention is happening in our city. And he's responsible for providing a full spectrum of home ownership services to prospective and current homeowners. He also is very, very active in the Worcester community, serves on a number of boards, and I was delighted to find out that he was a former Peace Corps member in Colombia and actually stayed there for 8 years. So you don't think of a Paquette habla Espanol, but he does very well. And that, I'm sure, has been a great bonus in his job. So I'm going to turn this over to the panelists. Please write your questions down. Know that there will be plenty of time for them. And in advance, please excuse any of the comings and goings and just keep your eyes focused on the panelists. Okay? Thank you.
As Maureen was saying, my name is Josh Lappen and I work for the Mass Housing Partnership. For those of you that don't know of us, we go by the acronym MHP, and we're a quasi-public state agency, and our role is to support affordable housing all across the state. I actually work on the commercial lending side, where one of our main products, if you will, is to finance multifamily rental housing. And so I underwrite loans day in and day out that eventually will help to finance buildings that you see around Worcester, around Boston, and that's kind of how I fit into the affordable housing world. A lot of the projects that we do finance have low-income housing tax credits, and that's been affected by subprime. That's something I'm going to get to in a minute. But what I thought would be really helpful is to tell you a little bit more about kind of what MHP is doing, and also talk to you a little bit about mortgages in general, because I think I think it's one thing to say, okay, now people are losing their homes, foreclosures are on the rise, but to not really understand how that all happened and why it might have all happened and how we're going to pull ourselves out of this mess. And Maureen said it, and Sue Connolly in my office, Worcester is really a great place because you've got so many people here who are really working together to bring about change. So before I go on, if you can have a show of hands of who owns a home. Got a few people. Anybody been affected by subprime? No hands yet. Well, that's good. Let me just step back a little bit. I think when when you maybe were applying, so years ago when you used to go to get a mortgage, you'd go to your local bank around the corner and you'd say, I'd like to buy this home, and for simplicity we'll go with $500,000. I'm not saying that everybody's going to be buying a $500,000 house, but just you go to the bank and you say, I'd like to buy a $500,000 home, and the bank would say to you, well, that's great, you can buy that home, but we want you to put 20% down. We want you to take 20% of the cash to pay for the house, and we'll give you a mortgage for $400,000. And that assumes that you've got good credit, and the bank is and you've got a good job that can support a mortgage of that level at the interest rates, that are prevailing at the time. So basically, when you think you're now owning this home, you've got a small share of that home. And what that bank's going to do when they give you that loan is they're going to go right down to the registry of deeds, and they're going to stick a mortgage on there. Which means the bank actually, until you pay off that mortgage, the bank owns your home. And you're just making payments to the bank in the same way that you may be making payments to a landlord, except at the end of the day, you have the ability to hopefully sell the house for more than what you paid for it, or at least what you paid for it. And you're going to hopefully realize some of the equity in that house over time. What's been happening in recent years is that interest rates have been very, very low. As interest rates are low, that fuels a lot of other things. It fuels what we call speculative bubbles. It also helped to fuel the housing prices. So housing prices are really creeping up. So you might have been able to buy a home for $100,000 a few years ago, but now it's going to cost you $200,000. And prices just keep going up and up and up, and when are they going to stop? I think we all kind of know when they're going to stop now, but a few years ago we didn't. So banks got a little bit more creative to try to let other home buyers into the market. And you hear probably, everybody saying it's the American dream to own a home, and it really is. If you can own a home and eventually realize equity, you're in a better position than somebody who is maybe renting and doesn't have that. So there is really a push to home ownership, but you've got to be able to make the numbers work and make it affordable. And I think what banks were seeing is that as rates were getting lower, prices were getting higher, not everybody could afford a mortgage, so they got a little creative with the mortgage products. Many people who had mortgages got a fixed rate mortgage, meaning that if you get a mortgage at 6% for 30 years, it stays at 6% for 30 years. Banks started offering adjustable rate mortgages, which would start at a level, say maybe at 5%, and it would be fixed for a certain period of time, and then it would adjust every year till the end of 30 years. When you get a 5-year adjustable mortgage, you're really getting a 30-year loan. You're just getting a fixed payment for 5 years, and then depending on what the adjustment says, it could be an adjustment every year thereafter, or adjustment every 3 years thereafter. And there are caps to what the banks will charge in terms of interest rates over time if you've gone to a reputable lender. But there are some lenders don't have caps on where that interest rate can go. So just to throw out a few numbers, if you were to get a mortgage for $300,000 at a rate of 5% for 30 years, you're looking at monthly payments in total of about $1,750. And basically, that means you should be making about $75,000 to be able to afford that mortgage. If you were fixed, so you get an ARM, so you get that adjustable rate mortgage, you're fixed at 5%, and then maybe there's an uncapped adjustment, there was a little teaser rate to get you in, and then the rate jumps up to 10%, your payment goes up from $1,750 to $2,750. That's $1,000 a month that payment goes up. And it jumps, and to be able to afford that payment, you need about $117,000. So I'm just trying to get across kind of how maybe products have changed and how when, a little change in rate, I guess it's 5 basis points, 5%, a change in rate really has a major impact. So many banks were lending on the thought that prices were going to go up, and that if you couldn't afford the payments when the rate adjusted, you would be able to sell your home to somebody else. And what was also happening is that banks started to say, well, we'll get creative with product, we'll give you a mortgage for 80%, and then we'll give you a home equity loan for 20%. And so you have 100% financing, meaning that the bank basically owns your home at this point. You have no equity in the deal, you have no cash in the deal. So if you've got a mortgage for $500,000, the bank gave you money, $500,000, and property values drop. Say property values drop to $450,000 for your house, and you want to sell it to somebody else is only going to pay you $450,000, and you owe the bank $500,000. So that means that $50,000 has to come out of your pocket to repay the bank to get out of that house. And what's happening, what we're starting to see, and what these guys are going to talk to, is that as property values drop and the value of your mortgage is more than the value of the property, if you didn't put any money in to begin with, you don't really have a stake in that property. And people have been walking away from their houses because their mortgage is more than what the property is worth. They're not personally losing any money, although I would say that these people are losing a tremendous amount. You lose your credit, and I think that's really what's starting to happen.
As far as foreclosures, when we first started to see a difference, notice something was going on in the city, was about the end of 2006. That's when we first started to see banks were owning properties. It was few and far between at that point, but we did notice something is happening. Ultimately, we were required to change. The market was changing, the city was changing, our field inspectors, out of necessity, had to change. We learned how to do research. We already knew how to research the registry of deeds and to find out property ownership. However, it forced us to also learn how to understand mortgage filings, mortgage assignments, complaints that are filed with the intent to foreclose, and what all of this terminology means, and how do we find who that local person is. How do we research the real estate multiple listing services to find out who a local person is to take care of that? Because as Josh had said, it's, you know, if it's a bank in California, they don't care that there's a pile of trash in the backyard or that the front door is open and people are able to get in. And in some cases, people are able to get in and maybe the utilities are still on and then basically stay there. At the same time, in about 2006, we also saw a very high volume of 3-family buildings being converted into condominium units, which exacerbated our research issues that we had. And again, out of necessity, learning what a master deed is, and if it's an 8-unit building, now it has literally 9 deeds that you have to research if you have violations associated in unit number 3, finding out how the ownership has been recorded at the registry. So certainly out of necessity, we've done this, learned how to do the research. In January of 2007, City Manager Michael O'Brien created a multi-departmental group. And essentially they were put in place to enforce quality of life issues at properties. It consists of 2 police officers, a sergeant and an officer, a fire prevention inspector, and a housing enforcement officer. This is called the Property Review Team. I am the head of that team, which is directly overseen by the city manager as well. That's how of high importance this is. They are assisted with a database that pulls all of the police data, fire data, the housing enforcement data, public health, including restaurants, animal control, air and water hazardous materials, buildings, GIS information, assessors, treasurer's information, all regarding specific properties, all funneling into one database. So it's pretty an extensive database that we have that is assisting our inspectors out in the field, and again, I'll say it out of necessity. One of the ways that we are using the database is to look at properties and look at the number of calls and targeting properties that have a high volume of calls that have become a drain on our resources. One example of that is when we have 4 different fire department shifts working on the trucks, and they're repeatedly going to, say, a particular building because the occupants are maybe it's a lodging house and they have a common kitchen and they're having issues with the fire alarm system going off because of food on the stove. What we'll do is we'll take a look at those calls and try to isolate what that problem is, pay a visit to the property, and determine, well, there's some education that needs to go on to the occupants. However, in addition to that, we obviously need to install a fan, a hood system above the stove to eventually eradicate the number of calls that go to that property for that reason. That's one of the ways that we're using the database. The direct effects of the foreclosures that we have seen is our normal enforcement methods and efforts are not working. We issue a violation order, give the property owner a specific amount of time to make the corrections, and if they did not comply at the expiration of that order, we would bring them to housing court, and the housing court would be able to produce an order, and we could bring them to contempt for that order for failing to comply, and ultimately they could face fines and or jail time. When you have a bank in California It doesn't necessarily work that smoothly. The other issue is that we certainly see is in the process of a foreclosure, it is long, it's lengthy. You have buildings that are that's taking maybe 4 to 6 months, sometimes at a minimum, from the beginning of the foreclosure process that's been recorded at the Registry of Deeds to the actual foreclosure deed being filed, and that last paperwork is what makes that bank legally responsible. So they're holding out. But in the meantime, we've had property owners that have, as Josh had said, fled. They're in major financial trouble. Sometimes it was their own home. Sometimes this was their rent. This was their rental income. They needed all 3 floors to be occupied to be able to pay that mortgage. Maybe they had a vacancy. Maybe they had a tenant who stopped paying rent. But now they can no longer pay. We're finding that the property owners have all but disappeared, and enforcement in housing court certainly is not available to us. We've gone and changed our role in as far as we are stepping onto the property and taking care of some of the violations that need to be corrected. I work very close with Scott Hayman and his office with in the city, and when we come upon buildings that are vacant, that we know are vacant, and they need to be secured, we do issue an order to try to get them secure. However, we're finding that nothing is happening. We will have that property boarded up. We have there is a contract with a board up company. They go out, they board up the property. Ultimately, Scott's office sends me the invoice, and we place a lien against the property. So before the bank can take over and file that last foreclosure deed, our lien gets satisfied prior. We're doing this with not just board ups, we're doing cleanups on properties. We've stepped in and started to make repairs to properties to try to preserve tenancies. However, in some cases, preserving the tenancy of the occupants isn't the best for the property or the occupants. So in some cases, we are condemning properties that are occupied and ultimately relocating those, relocating those tenants. We have working with the Central Mass Housing Alliance to assist in finding new housing, setting them up in a hotel temporarily, purchasing or renting a storage units, renting vehicles for people to move their belongings out, and in cases where it is safest for the occupants. One of the other things that we're doing and newest as of late is receivership. We're looking to our nonprofits in the area, and however we have had some for-profit landlords and contractors step up to the plate, want to become receivers for property, and ultimately it's a court-appointed receiver. They in fact turn and take over the property. They begin to collect the rents from the property, and they also begin to make the repairs at the property. So it's an effort to preserve the occupants and the tenancy in the building rather than displacing people and ultimately become homeless. A couple of real street examples. We've had some of the things that we've run into, and one of the reasons why we do have staff who are working with police officers is when we do have a report of a vacant building, we will go in with an officer because ultimately they are armed and we are not. And we're finding that in the vacant buildings, and in one example over on Jake's Ave in the city, when we went to verify the conditions that it was vacant, the inspectors are there with their flashlight because the light in the room happened to not work, and he's looking at the drug paraphernalia on the ground, and as he's walking with his head down, he sees a pair of shoes, and there's feet in them, and he goes up, and there's someone hiding in the closet. These are the kind of things that, as an inspector armed with a pen and a clipboard, we do need an officer, because maybe that person is certainly unhappy, we're going to be taking away their shelter from them, and we are absolutely at risk. And in cases like that, it was, you know, we had the building boarded up, we had the building cleaned, the electricity was still on, the heat was still on, and the water was still on, and the owner had completely checked out, they were gone, and so that nobody was around to care for the building. We had to shut all the utilities off to make, this was in the middle of the winter, so we don't want it to be a place where someone can basically take up illegal residence at a property.
Homeownership, we do believe, in spite of this big struggle that we have on our hands now, is a key to any successful, stable neighborhood. And in fact, I will say, there's always good and bad and good. From 2000, during this whole crazy time when the lending industry just went a little overboard perhaps, from 2000 to 2006, the American Community Housing Survey, by the time we got to 2006, we were at a rate of 47% homeownership, which is, it may not seem a lot, but we have a lot of three-deckers, so you only get 1 in 3, and we don't recommend a condo conversion. So we were actually making some real strides through our community development corporations and others, and with a great boost from, at that time, was it really seemed like inexhaustible access to credit and things like that. So now, just briefly for perspective, in January '06, there were 27 complaints filed by banks or lenders. 27 complaints, that's an initial step where a bank says, you know, the homeowner's not paying their mortgage, we're going to go to the registry of deeds and file our notice or intent to foreclose on this property. So in January '06, there were 27 complaints and 5 foreclosures, okay, in the city of Worcester. In recent months, from approximately, basically, midsummer to the present, the average is about 171 complaints, and on the foreclosure deeds, actual banks taking over, it's roughly about 55 homes a month are being foreclosed, taken back over by the banks. And we've had troubles in the past. Yep, 55 a month. So our numbers correspond. One thing with MHP's help that we've been able to do is poke right into the registry of deeds data, and previous to that, get access from Banker, Tradesman, and Warren Group with the help of MHP to find out what kind of mortgages are out there and what we're facing. So that's the current trends, and that's the work of Amanda, just overwhelming at times, but I will say, with the city manager's leadership, we've become very strategic, and we've targeted streets and neighborhoods that we know, and that's the first step, to know what you're facing. We know what's going on in the neighborhoods. What's the scope going ahead? Will it end soon? Somebody said, is it a buyer's or a seller's market, and all that kind of stuff. Going forward, we will, in essence, well, before I start that, about 1 in 5 mortgages now nationwide are adjustable rate mortgages, approximately. So there's a lot of them out there. And in fact, from about, let me give you just one little piece of information because it's interesting. And the adjustable rate mortgages, you know what they are, right? Everybody does?
Just refresh me, please.
Adjustable rate mortgage is when you make a deal with your bank or lender that you will get one rate for a period of time, and then after that period of time, the rate can adjust upwards according to any variety of indexes and so forth. Okay. And largely it does go up. So there was basically in 2005, there were $100 billion worth of these mortgages out there nationwide that in that year were scheduled to reset or adjust upward. In 2006, there was $375 billion of adjustable rate mortgages out there scheduled to reset. In 2007, $1 trillion. So $1 trillion worth of mortgages that have been granted or given from borrowers to banks with these adjustable rates. You know, were they all horrible and nasty? No, I have an adjustable rate mortgage. I have a 5/1 ARM. If you know what you're doing, an adjustable rate mortgage isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. But certainly, if you get into what's called the deeper predatory lending practices or subprime lending practices that absolutely fueled this whole mess, that's where you really get into trouble, where, as Josh mentioned, mortgages can reset with payment shock from, 8% already starting very high because your credit isn't very good or you're a high-risk person, and then reset to 11 or 12 or 13%. That's somewhat prevalent. So going forward in Worcester, just Worcester, not Worcester County, we have that reset data. We know who has an adjustable reset mortgage coming up, thanks to MHP, and there's about 2,018 households that are facing an adjustable reset. So that's kind of really what we're faced with, and Fran will speak to that a little more in terms of what we're doing about that. But interestingly, this is not just an inner city problem. This is a countywide problem, citywide problem, nationwide problem. The majority, frankly, of people facing these resets are single-family homeowners, and they actually are scattered and dispersed quite evenly across Worcester, not just in the Main South or South Worcester. Obviously, a neighborhood that was very vulnerable to begin with, like Main South or South Worcester, is going to be perhaps hardest hit with this whole spillover effect on foreclosures. But there are really quite good, smart, intelligent people all throughout Worcester who took adjustable rate mortgages thinking, like probably many of us only 4 or 5 years ago, that the American dream, would never end, that you could just, if you will, sit on your sofa and your house would just go up in value. And you could go take the home equity loan out if you liked, and for sometimes valid reasons, send your children to school or buy a laptop or otherwise. But in 2004 or 5, we were number 5 in the nation as the fastest growing housing market. Now, for those of us who know the market very well, it was like scary. It's like, what do you mean? It's the same 3-decker that only in 1999 or 2000 was worth $80, $90, $110,000, and it had peaked to where not long ago, 6, 7, 8 months ago, 3-deckers were selling for $365,000, right? So why? Because it was the tail end of just incredible amounts of greed. So that's when a lot of the worst kind of loans were written, 2005, 6, 7, where they were digging deeper to find people to borrow and buy a home and so forth. And so really that largely gives you a perspective, if you will, on what was happening. I'll quickly just try to summarize, because there's really too much to summarize. What has the local government done about it? We've heard about that. We have our SAVE plan, which I think Maureen gave to everybody.
Well, there are
many-
copies
Yep.
over there on that table before you leave of the SAVE plan. I don't know if we have enough for everybody, but I can get them to you if you want. So, Sarah, you're in charge of the SAVE. There's Sarah.
Right.
See Sarah for your SAVE plan
That's
before you leave.
That's also on the City of Worcester's website.
Yes.
So anybody, it has some of the data I just recited to you in it. The SAVE plan, Amanda's a huge part of. This is our first pass, our first emergency response to a huge issue. It's supposed to be a living and breathing document. We're not even remotely done. The issue is not close to settled. There's lots more to do. So at the local level, I'll leave it at that. I think to an extent, Worcester is, yes, hardest hit perhaps in the Commonwealth, or one of the hardest hit communities, but also probably perhaps more prepared than other communities. We've been working throughout at the state level with other communities, and increasingly they want a copy of the SAVE plan and they want to read it closely and understand. We did good planning and so forth, so it's a good document.
I guess, listening to the other speakers, there really was a state level and the city in terms of the properties, kind of statistics. We're the organization that really sees the face of foreclosure. We're the ones that are dealing with the people that are being foreclosed on. We're the ones that get the calls, and not unusual to have people start crying over the phone, explaining the situations. I have to hand it to my staff. They really are very compassionate people. They're very skilled people. And they really are on the front lines and really put in a full day of work in that area. Just want to give you a brief overview of what the Homeownership Center is. We're a nonprofit agency here in Worcester. We've got 5 partner agencies. We've got the City of Worcester, Central Mass Housing Alliance, which has been mentioned a number of times, Worcester Community Housing Resources, Worcester Eastside CDC, and Oak Hill CDC are the partners. We get funding, some funding from NeighborWorks America, a large amount of funding from the City of Worcester, Mass Housing Partnership, Mass Housing, some state initiatives, some federal initiatives. Pretty much we solicit money through foundations. I mean, we're always hat in hand trying to get enough money to survive and keep offering the services. Up to about a year ago, our primary service was first-time homebuyer classes. We do an 8-hour first-time homebuyer class. People just getting started in the process. They come in, we bring in a number of, we do an 8-hour class, we bring in a number of speakers, we bring in a realtor, we bring in a lender, we bring in an insurance agent, we bring in a lawyer, home inspector, really giving an overview of what is involved in purchasing a home, maintaining a home, getting a mortgage, what a good mortgage is, what a bad mortgage is. And I also conduct a part on how to avoid bad mortgages, how to avoid predatory lenders. About a year ago, it switched. We're still doing pre-purchase classes. Just one other thing, the Home Ownership Center is certified under CHAPA. CHAPA is the state agency, or it's an agency that oversees the nonprofit housing counseling centers. We have a code of conduct, we have certain rules that we have to abide by. We want to make sure that when we're giving out information on purchasing a home, it's not biased, we're not steering anyone to any particular mortgage product or lender, and we uphold those rules. You'll see a lot of real estate agents, a lot of lenders will conduct home buyer classes in their agencies. They're good, but they're also, and I hate to say this in front of Susan, they're a little bit biased. They want you to use their products, and that's why they're having those classes. We do it so that you gain the education. So anyone who hasn't purchased a home, please think about going to a nonprofit counseling agency to take a pre-purchase class when you're interested in buying a home. You get the straight information. You can use our counselors after the fact to talk to them about, here's the mortgage offers that I've received, point out the good items, the bad things in these products, so that you're educated in terms of what you're getting into. We're finding a lot now with in the foreclosure area, people did not know what they were signing for. They were totally oblivious to what kind of mortgage products they were into. It's really a sad situation. Some of them really got taken. Some of them made absolutely poor financial choices, but we'll get into that later. About a year ago, we started getting all kind of phone calls about foreclosures. A lot of people, and because we're part of the national foreclosure efforts, there's an 800 number, sponsored by the Home Ownership Preservation Foundation. It's an 800 number that is staffed 24 hours a day by counselors across the country that are giving foreclosure advice to people that are calling in, kind of looking at their budgets and making suggestions how they can possibly save their home. A lot of times they're referring them to the nonprofit agencies, for example, our agency. So we're getting a lot of referrals from that. Originally, hold that question for a second. Originally, the hotline was set up to handle, I believe it was 6,000 phone calls a month. It was up to 6,000 phone calls a week. In December, it was 2,500 phone calls a day. And in January and February, I believe it was about 3,300 phone calls a day. And those are distinct individual families. So that's kind of and those are the people that know about the 800 number. So it's growing. It's a tremendous concern. It's a concern because the Home Ownership Center, we have a staff of 7 people now, and it really is, I have maybe the equivalent of 2 people working in foreclosures. And with the amount of phone calls and referrals we're getting, it's hard to stay afloat. Somebody in the back had a question? The 800 number is 888-995-HOPE. It's called the HOPE Foundation, HOPE Coalition. It's actually part of the Hope Now Coalition across the country.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So because we're getting so many phone calls, we started doing triage clinics. Every other week, we have a class, it's a foreclosure 101 class. On a Thursday evening, people come in. Before they can talk to the counselors, they have to come to the foreclosure 101 class. We find it's beneficial that everybody get the straight information up front. What is foreclosure? What are the timelines? What are alternatives? What are alternatives? What are your alternatives if you can afford to stay in that property? What are your alternatives if you cannot afford to stay? So a big part of this is looking at people's budgets, making sure we have an accurate budget, and then seeing can they afford the product that they're in. If they can afford to stay in that home and they can afford the product, the mortgage, there's any number of different things that we can do. They can do a traditional refinance if they have more equity in the home than what is outstanding. They can do a home saver product that Scott explained. There's $250 million in that program. The first 8 months, I don't think a loan was made. In the last 2 months, 11 loans were made out of that program. We have the ability to call loan servicers and talk to the loan servicers and say, can we modify this loan? These people have a positive budget, but they can't afford a 10% interest rate because the ARM adjusted. They can't afford 6.5%. If you don't modify the loan, you're probably going to take that property back in foreclosure, and you're going to lose X amount of dollars by doing that foreclosure process. Or if you rewrite the loan at an interest rate that they can afford, it's a win all around. The people can stay in their home, they can continue paying that mortgage, they can save the property, it won't go into receivership, it won't be abandoned, it won't be boarded up. So we can do that. We can also offer repayment plans if they have suitable savings. There's some small amount of rescue funds that are available that we can help people refinance their product. If they can't afford to stay, they can do a sale or a short sale of the property. Short sale is where the lender would agree that because they bought that triple-decker a year ago at $330 and it's now worth $170, the lender would accept receiving $170 to make that mortgage whole and free and clear. Will they accept that? With that kind of a loss, sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. They know that housing prices have come down. They know they can't take that property in foreclosure and get $330,000 for it. They have to make a financial decision. A lot of times they have to talk to the ultimate investor in that loan to see if they will accept that. Another one is deed in lieu of foreclosure, where the lender would agree that the homeowner will come in, leave the keys on the desk, tear up the mortgage, and then everybody's free and clear. That doesn't happen too often because the banks, the lenders, do not want to be property owners, as we're seeing pretty frequently. Scott mentioned the 2,000 adjustable rate mortgages in Worcester over the next 12, 18 months. We're doing outreach to them traditionally or statistically across the country. About 17, 18% of those mortgages go into foreclosure. That's statistically across the country. 17% of 2,000 mortgages could end up in foreclosure. That's what, 340 properties potentially? And that's just the initial adjustment. Talk about the two-year ARM. That's the adjustment after 2 years. We're not talking about every 6 months thereafter it being adjusted again. We're just talking about that initial. So 17% of the people that have adjustable rate mortgages, when they hit that first reset, they can't afford that new payment. It's really a sad situation. Just to go back a little bit, in terms of the pre-purchase side, just to show you the kind of efforts that we're doing at the center. In the 12 months ended June 30th of 2007, we had 453 people go through our first-time homebuyer class. So far in 9 months this year, we have 317. Last year, 213 of those people purchased homes. So far this year, 120. So people still are buying. It's a great time to buy. The housing prices have lowered. Interest rates are still pretty low. Those 213 families that purchased a year ago, that represented $43.7 million in mortgages. This year it's up to it's 24.2 million. So we are seeing still a number of people coming in for first-time homebuyer classes, still wanting that education. I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting that education. You really need to know what you're getting into. And I'll give you some information about the people we're seeing that are coming in facing foreclosure. We're seeing the traditional ones, the ones you would expect, people that have had deaths, divorce, loss of jobs. But we're getting, as I said before, the people that made poor financial choices. We saw a lady about a month ago, purchased a home 10 years ago for $95,000. In 10 years, she's refinanced 12 times, now owes $370 on the property, and the property is now valued at about $340. She can't refinance again because she's upside down. She owes more than what the property is worth. She's maxed out her credit cards. She probably couldn't afford the home, so she'd keep running up her credit cards, paying her bills, and then go to the bank, refinance. Well, that's fine until, well, the housing prices keep going up. But when it hits the wall and starts coming down, there's no alternative. We're seeing people with temporary losses of jobs, and those are the easier ones to deal with. A lot of times, the homeowners are calling the 800 number on their mortgage statements every month, which is the collections department of the banks or the lenders. Well, the collection department's job is to collect every penny that's outstanding. We tell people when they come to us, you want to call the loss mitigation department of the lender. That's the department that really wants to minimize the losses to the bank or to the lender. The collection department, their job is to collect money. Loss mitigation is to lose the least amount of money. And that, if you have anyone that's facing foreclosure, those are the people that should be talking to the loss mitigation departments. Getting back to the adjustable rate mortgages, we are outreaching to them. We are sending them out mailings. We want to get them in as quickly as possible so we can look at their budgets to make sure that they can afford the rate adjustment. Or get them early enough in the process so that we can talk about refinancing. Once they're behind in their mortgages, their credit score plummets. They might be upside down in their mortgage. They lose the ability to refinance that property at a traditional lender. So what we want to do is get them in early enough so that we can help them to find some suitable alternative so they can stay in that home and not lose it.
Well, I would just like to say thank you to all of you who have come, and let's have a big hand for our panelists. I would just like to close this by saying 4 weeks ago, was it, in the semester, I assigned essay question to the housing clubs. And their first question was to address the presidential candidates because housing wasn't even out there as an issue. And it's creeping on the table. Each of the candidates now has something that they want to speak to on this. But it seems to me that this is a national issue as well as a state and local issue. And we would do well to push the candidates to find out how they would address this problem. So I think it's leadership on every level, and what I would end by saying, it's very refreshing to meet and greet some of the local and state leadership here for what they're doing to help us through this rough patch. And thank you to each of you for coming, and thank you for all of your interest.